What's up, YouTube? So we're here in my Thomas, and I thought I would discuss with you guys today about ICCE buses. Part of the reason I'm making this is I've seen a lot of comments lately on ICCE buses from you guys, as well as newer buses with electronic engines. ICCE buses are by far a very nice looking bus. I will say that. They are a highly modified Ward/Amtran body. That's where they originated from. The body itself is manufactured no different than any other school bus has ever been made. There's nothing different about it other than it's got some features that distinguish it, like the your slanted insides of your warning light masks and whatnot. And that does look pretty cool, I will say that. However, those of you young guys that are really interested in owning a bus and swear up and down that you guys want an ICCE, or maybe some of you Skoolie converters that would like an ICCE, listen up. Owning a bus is not cheap, okay? When things break, and they do, these aren't, brand new vehicles. These are secondhand used vehicles that people have, previously owned. Things break, and you got to realize whoever you buy this from, maybe their maintenance wasn't that good. Maybe the person that drove the bus prior didn't take care of it. Maybe they were really hard on it. Maybe they weren't hard enough on it. One of the biggest problems with ICCE buses is the Maxxforce engines. And here's why. Prior to the Maxxforce engines in 2008, you could get a VT365 or a DT466E. Now, the VT365 is the same motor that Ford calls the 6.0 Power Stroke. It was made by International, put in Fords. The 6.0 Power Stroke has a bad reputation for EGR coolers and problems with them. And what that is EGR is exhaust gas recirculation, and it is an emissions control. So it takes some of the exhaust gas and it sends it back through the intake. Now, exhaust gas in these motors gets hot, okay? When the motor is under stress, your exhaust gases get very hot, and as they go through that exhaust gas, that EGR cooler, what happens is it goes through, there's antifreeze tubes and they're coolant tubes that circulate engine coolant through that, and they will wear out over time. And what happens is you start leaking coolant into your intake. And those EGR coolers are not cheap to replace. I'm not sure what kind of figure we're talking, but a few $100. So not only that, on that motor, they're really hard to get to. Everything is all stuffed into the engine compartment, all the wiring, everything. So you've got that to consider. DT466E of that vintage prior to 2008 also had that EGR cooler on it. So now you've got the reliable DT466 that everybody loves about with the 6.0 EGR cooler on it. And those things were just as notorious for blowing their EGR coolers. So you got that to worry about. Once you got into the Maxxforce engines in 2008, now you have the diesel particulate filter, which is the soot catcher, the big catalytic converter and emissions system. Those emissions systems are not cheap to maintain. Every now and then you have to pull the DPF off and clean it out. And that requires a very expensive machine to do it with. If you don't have that machine, then you have to take it somewhere and let somebody do it. And that costs, a few $100. So already, even if whether you're running a Maxxforce 7, which is the 6.4 Power Stroke for the Ford people, or the Maxxforce DT, you've still got to get that DPF cleaned every now and then. Regens some of them require that the mechanics plug the computer into the bus to inhibit the regeneration, which is cleaning of the DPF, using the bus. A lot of these bus drivers don't drive the buses very hard. They're very gentle on them, and that's majority of the reason why these DPFs clog up, is because the driver's not driving hard enough on it. So driving harder on the Maxxforce is good to help keep the DPFs clean and whatnot, but you still have to take them off every now and then and clean them out. So that's one thing. You've got all that emission stuff. Not only that, if any of you guys subscribe to Joe's Bus Barn, I highly recommend it. He works on ICs a lot. I just watched him do an entire wiring harness on, it was an 06 ICCE, so it wasn't even a Maxxforce. So the engine uses a lot of computerized sensors, just like a modern car engine does. And all of your computer signals have to have perfect wiring to go through. A lot of these cars today that have check engine light problems and they're not working quite right, it's because there's a wiring problem. Could be a loose connection somewhere, but a computer signal has to be precise in order to get a good reading. If the signal is wrong or if the wiring is bad in any way, it's going to degrade the signal, which will throw a check engine light and affect performance. So Joe just had to replace on a DT466E an entire engine and transmission wiring harness. That was $2,800 from International. Rather than try to go through and find the bad wiring, and it's miles of wiring, mind you. This is the entire wiring harness for the engine, from the computer to the engine, the transmission, the starter, everything. So $2,800 to replace that. That's a lot of money. And you youngsters that love these CEs, that's a lot of money. I paid less than that for this Thomas. I paid less than that for both my buses combined, for my Thomas and my Bluebird. So, yeah, that's a lot of money. So, not to mention tires, and that's on any bus. A brand new 11R 22.5 tire, I've seen them for $240, $250. You have 6 of them, and that doesn't include, disposal of the old tires, mounting, dismounting, balancing. That's a lot of money. If you do a tire job for a whole bus, you're looking at, $1,200. If you're getting new tires. Used tires, it's, $100, $150 a tire. So, but, that's besides the point with ICCEs. Another thing with ICCEs is multiplex wiring, and this is common with all of the new buses now. So, what multiplex wiring is instead of like a normal older vehicle or older style circuit, where you have a positive wire going to a switch and then continuing off that switch to the light or whatever is being powered, and then a ground wire going back to the battery. That's a basic circuit. That's all it is. Positive to, with a switch in the middle, so the switch turns the positive on and off. Then it continues to the device that's being powered, and then there's a ground coming off of it back to the battery. That's all it is. So, like my Thomas here. Let's pull the phone down so you can see. I've got tons of switches here on my panel. And a light monitor. There's lots of wires in there. Lots and lots and lots of wires in there. So, and they each go, there is what's called a bus bar in there, and that's a common bar with positive electrical current going to it. And all of the switches get their power from that bus bar. And there's fuses coming between the bus bar and the switch in case there's a short. And then from there, the wiring goes from the switch to whatever's being powered. And then whatever's being powered has a ground going to the negative. So on an ICCE, they use what's called multiplex wiring. And what that is instead of you having a wire for every single thing, you have a wire going to a computer. So, say like my warning lights. Instead of the flasher having individual wires for the reds and ambers going all the way to those lights, you have an individual wire going to a computer, which is a controller. And from that controller, you have a single wire going to another controller that intercepts that signal and the power and disperses it to whatever it's supposed to go to. So for instance, we activate our red warning lights. Left red is supposed to come on. Power from the flasher goes to the multiplex computer. It sends that and a signal across the line, the single line, to the receiver computer on the other end of the bus where the red is. And then from there, it sends the appropriate power out that channel to the red warning light, and it illuminates. If those that same wire, before I continue with that, could be powering a bunch of other things. It could be also powering brake lights. It could be powering a driver's fan. So it's that same single wire that's carrying power for all those things. And it's got signals going through it that are interpreted by the computer on the other end of the wire to send out the power wherever it needs to go. Those computers malfunction. And I've been on CEs where they malfunctioned. I've had issues where I go to honk the horn, and instead of the horn honking, the wipers turn on. And while some of y'all might think that's funny, it does sound kind of funny. When you own a bus and you're trying to make sure that it stays in good repair, and you start having problems like that all the time, that's a problem. That's a big problem. And now all of a sudden you're like, well, this sucks. My bus doesn't work right. I don't understand why. And the only way to diagnose it is to plug another computer into the bus to read it and figure out where the problem is and fix it. So already, instead of basic, like for me, all I need to work on my bus is basic hand tools. That's all I need. I can do everything with basic hand tools except take the wheels off. I need an air impact for that. I don't need any computers. I have no computers on my bus. None on either of them. I mean, there's no glow plugs on these DTs. They didn't use glow plugs. There's no engine cutoff solenoid. I have to pull the choke handles out, which is really awesome. There's nothing. The most sophisticated computerized equipment on my Thomas is the stereo. On the Bluebird, there's nothing at all remotely, computerized on it. It doesn't have a stereo yet, so when it does, that would be the most sophisticated thing. With an ICCE, you would have to get a computer with a data cable that you could plug into the bus, and you'd have to buy the software for it too. That's very expensive as well. The software for International to diagnose their products is several $1,000s. And you can use a cheap laptop, but you still have to have the software, and then you have to buy the data cable too. So, I know you guys really like the CEs, but it's just there's so much on them. Back to the motors. When you have a sensor go out on the CEs, any kind of sensor, your motor will stop. It'll either degrade greatly where you can't hardly drive it, or it'll just stop completely. I've been in CEs with I've never driven any of the V8 CEs. I've only driven Maxxforce DT and DT466E powered CEs. But I've had problems with the injection system where the IPR goes out and it doesn't want to run right. I've had problems with crank sensors. When the crank sensor goes out, the crank sensor tells the injection system what position the motor is in, so that it can fire the injectors accordingly. Cars have these too. If the crank sensor goes out, the motor won't run because the motor doesn't know where it is. The computer doesn't, so it doesn't know how to fire the injectors. So it'll just shut the motor down. And most of the time when a crank sensor goes out, it has nothing to do with the crank being out of order or anything like that. It's just the sensor failed. So now all of a sudden you've got to diagnose why your motor's not running, why it's running like crap, because certain sensors in these buses will make the motor run like crap. I've had one where an IPR was acting funky, which is an injection pressure relay, I believe, or regulator. I can't remember. It has to do with the injection system. it made it run really, really rough. And I've never had a bus run that rough. It was enough to where I was getting car sick driving it. And I've never, ever gotten car sick driving a bus. So, just little things like that. Wiring your Maxxforce engines. And by the way, a lot of school districts have class action lawsuits still against Navistar because of the Maxxforce diesels and how horribly unreliable they were. A lot of these buses stayed off the road, especially down here. So, if I were you guys, I know you think that the CEs just are the best looking buses ever, and I get it. When I grew up, I rode S-Series, and I rode the beginning 3800s, before the electronic motors came out. I was fortunate enough that the school district I went to only had DT 466s. That's it. And they had gas motors. I actually got to ride on some old gas S-Series. And the school district I drove for, that this Thomas is from, had gas S-Series and gas Lodestars. My first grade year, we had a gas Lodestar there. But, I get it. Those were the buses that I saw at school. I understand. But for those of you guys looking to buy a bus just to have it, if you buy a CE, it's not going to run very long. You're going to have problems. That's all there is to it, No matter how well you take care of it, as these things sit, things still do break on them. I've come out before to find, broken wiring on my Thomas. I got a crossover mirror that the bracket, the nuts on the back side of the bracket have worked their way loose, and it wobbles, and I got to get new nuts for it. It is what it is. It's the nature of the beast. When you own a vehicle that you don't drive daily and it sits, even if you own a vehicle that you drive daily and you drive it all the time, things will break. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And with the CEs, you're going to have lots of trouble. So, anyway, that's my rant for today. I hope I didn't upset too many people by degrading CEs. I do think they're a really awesome looking bus. But I'm not into new buses like that. A CE, every CE to me looks the same. So I like the old buses like mine. I like the 3800s, the S-Series, all these old buses, They were good buses back in the day. They were built stronger than a lot of today's new buses. The CEs use a thinner gauge sheet metal for their skin than my Thomas and my Bluebird use. They weren't made to last. They were just made to get the job done. And that's unfortunate that our society has gone to that. But anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next video.